Short and sweet today. We will start with Clare Pollard's Delphi, which comes to us from Fig Tree, Penguin Books. This is one that David read. Clare Pollard is an editor and poet, so, you know, she knows what she's doing with her words. It's a pandemic set, very small book, and this is the theme for today. One of those books which David said of it, it is at once, because he was dubious when he picked it up and said, ooh, do I want to read about lockdowns again? And found this both joyous and cathartic. And in my opinion, you can't really do much better than that. So we have London set in the middle of a pandemic. And our narrator is approaching middle age, has a young son who seems to be kind of withdrawing a little bit from her. And she is looking at, through the kind of the device of the different types of, in mythology, the different types of looking at the future, of augury, of foreseeing and predicting. So it's very interesting parallels that we're able to draw between how in the olden days you might have been able to sort of thought you could tell what the future was going to bring by looking at birds or looking at sort of prophecy through wine, through mirrors, even through eggs. But the chapters or sections are broken up with these sort of facts, or not even really explanations of, but of this notion of augury. It's a little bit about how you can't even foresee that. We can't necessarily foresee, and foreseeing helps us to sort of get an idea that we might be controlling the chaos of the world, and how on the outer public life, how we think that we can have some sort of control, and even over our inner life. So this narrator is looking at her own life and sort of not realizing that things are possibly going to become catastrophic as well. And who could have sort of foreseen this? I think that's an expression we've all heard quite often recently. Very much, I think, for readers of Jenny Offals, whether maybe the Olivia Laing, Ali Smith type reader. Very interesting, dark, delicious, fun writing. So you laugh and you'll think. Quite a good combination, me does think. Next one up. These all are similar to each other in that they're not plot-driven books. They do something else, which is just as important. We have the Pachinko Parlour. It's written by Elisa Shua Dusapin, and she wrote Winter in Sokcho, which was also translated by Anissa Abbas Higgins. And that won one of the national book prizes for translated fiction. So very high-level translating going on here, and we need to mention our translators. This one is fascinating. I've just put it down and read it in one sitting. A very distilled piece of writing. We are in Tokyo, and we have a young Clare who's come over from Switzerland where she lives, and she has a boyfriend, Mathieu. And we learn as we advance through the book that her parents are Korean, but they've lived in Tokyo for at least 50 years. So we have that connection back to the sort of the separation of Korea into its two parts, and then the I suppose the sort of migration into Japan, and then how the Korean population was perceived. This is all very delicately sort of touched upon. There's nothing very blatant or overt about that. Our young narrator is jet-lagged. She's living with her grandparents. There are huge communication problems in that there are sort of unfinished sentences, and her grandmother seems to be perhaps losing a little bit of her communication skills. They run a Pachinko parlour, which, as you know, is one of those gambling parlours, which, even though gambling is illegal, it sort of straddles that borderline because there's no money prize given out. You're given some sort of, sort of token, if you like, as a prize. It can be from a stuffed animal to shampoo, toothpaste, all sorts of little things, even chewing gum. And they've been running that for a very long time. And she's there as a tutor to a young 12-year-old Mieko, whose mother is a French lecturer, and she's there to be speaking French to this young girl, and they have a kind of a disconnect. They live in a kind of abandoned hotel which will eventually be revamped, and the child lives downstairs in what was the swimming pool. So you have these kind of disaffected places that aren't quite right. I think this writing is it's more about how we perceive ourselves. It's a book very much about identity, and I think perhaps about language and how we communicate with each other, and how communication can be broken down. There's a lot of symbolism. We're looking a lot at the little girl is fascinated with animals, so she wants to go to the zoo and she wants to go to a theme park, and there are animals in these places, but sometimes they're only painted. Sometimes, like in the zoo, there's no real animal life for her to see, and there's this dissatisfaction always with an expectation and what is real. And I think this is something our narrator is going through as well. She thinks that her parents are on board, grandparents are on board with her coming to with them all going on a trip back to Korea, which is sort of the homeland, and then at the last minute her grandparents bail out of it because it's kind of not home, but she needs to go for herself for her Korean route. So that's kind of part of the tension of this sort of, it's not plotless, but it's not plotful. It's an exploration of communicating, of hearing, of not hearing, of it's sort of a little bit unsettling that way, but it's very beautiful, very distilled writing, and it's very much for that person who wants to read something that kind of feeds a less of a need for a racy page-turning plot. Though, mind you, I read it in one sitting. I was fascinated by her exploration of identity and culture. Fascinating read. Highly, highly recommend that one. Next one up is one that was, you will have seen this one, I think, a few times possibly. This was a Booker Prize long list, and a very unusual addition, many people felt, to the Booker as a Booker candidate. It comes to us from Fourth Estate. One that is a masterpiece, if you like, of treading that line between sort of I don't know, when I opened it up, I said, is this book for real? Because I had no idea at the beginning what was going on, and this made it ultimately intriguing to a really high level, and made me not work, but it made me really sort of settle into it and get my teeth into it and come to grips with what Garner is doing. Garner, as some of you may know, was, or at least I knew him as a children's author. He had, sort of the Brisingamen book, The Moon of Gomrath, books that I think my brother owned and I constantly stole from his shelves. Sorry, bro. Though he already knew. They're very steeped in mythologies, sort of what you feel is the very ancient British, as opposed to kind of Celtic Irish, or these mythologies that of course are culturally diverse, but it's steeped in this. We have a young boy, Joseph Coppag, at the very beginning, who hears the Rag and Bone Man, calls himself Treacle Walker, arrive outside the house, and it's their conversation and their kind of journey together. It's a book that deals with, I suppose in the beginning you think you're getting a sort of a pastoral feel, that kind of, not quite Thomas Hardy, but you sort of feel that there's that quaintness of Englishness and the seep of culture, and then all of a sudden it kind of swerves into almost cartoonish frames. Like, I don't mean that there's the physical drawing of it, but the way the chapters are laid out there, and how characters sort of seem to cross over the boundaries of each chapters into each other. We do have a reference to the Beano and Dandian characters that actually come into our story. We have an awful lot about boundaries in this. We have not going out superstitious boundaries, like you can't go past over the threshold unless you've scrubbed it clean with this stone. There's a lot of those kind of magic realism elements in it, and it is tightly knit with these references. There was a lot of riddling going on. Our character has to do this, has to work out what the riddles are, and we have to do it as well. So it's an awful lot about how we participate in story, how we are ourselves story, and how these myths and legends underpin our own memories or our own understanding of culture, and how, I suppose, how the myth, I'm not really sure, but how that myth is really a way of talking about everybody's life story and how it all becomes cyclical. At one point we have our main character kind of pinning legend to its proper place. So there's this idea about things are or aren't in their proper place. And in our own realities, we like things to be in their proper place. And Garner's kind of looking at this and saying, but sometimes they are both and not in their proper place, because if we look at the alternative reality of just looking at a world through the eye that is far seeing instead of the eye that is kind of not seeing, which is a very common theme in all of these books. There's what we can see, what we can't see, what we can hear and what we can't hear, and which is the more successful for giving us access to a kind of truth. So Garner is looking at how these stories have their place, how they're important to us, and how they challenge our perception of what our reality is. So they're about commonality as much as about, I suppose, in being an individual. We get our young boy who starts off as looking at this rag and bone man about the value of objects, and how in the long run he transforms as well into that same character. An astonishingly round story, loads to get your teeth into. And even then, I haven't got enough words for it. Stupendous. Next one up, another beaut. So Brood by Jackie Polzin. I will find my notes on this one. I've just, about to say I've just put that one down, and you must all be thinking, how does she put all of these down on the same day? Comes to us from Picador, and I must admit, it is a debut. I was knocked sideways by this one as well. They say that if you like Elizabeth Strout and Tyler, you'll like this. It's even more, not plotless, but it's even more sort of detached. It is a masterclass in quiet understatement. I think that's what I've said. It's about what occupies us. And our main character in this is a young woman living with a husband who's a very easygoing, little bit self-absorbed, online for tenure as an associate professor, and he's popular into socio-economics, that sort of domain, and she cleans houses. You get the feeling that she's terribly intelligent, because you've kind of conflating our narrator and our main character, but you can sense with her thoughts that she's a thinker, but that she's also a little bit on hiatus, and she's actually quite happy with that with being just a house cleaner for a friend who is in real estate and has, when houses are up for sale, she's the one who kind of does this maintenance. And you also learn very gently that in one of these houses, cleaning a bathroom, she had a miscarriage, and that the child was much wanted. But there's no big drama. She deals with this all with a kind of quiet grieving. And into this, we're plonked straight into this, but you realise that the arrival of these chickens, or hens, into the story might be, is it this displacement of affection that she doesn't say it? You're kind of deducing, are they replacing children? Is she never going to be able to have children? You also learn that Percy, her husband, is going to, with this tenure, they're probably going to have to leave this house. And she's terribly fond of this house. There's a little quiet cast of these neighbours who kind of hate the hens because they make a bit of noise in the morning, particularly the cluckiness before popping an egg. And each of these hens becomes a named character. You feel this great love for them. They know literally zilch zero about hen keeping, only they're in Minnesota and they do know they to look out for extremes of weather, because hens don't do well in either. So it's all about how she's trying to preserve these hens, and by preserving them, maybe preserve herself. But one by one, we learn what happens to each of these hens. There's Gam Gam, there's Darkness, and there's Gloria, they're all have got a special place in her heart. And, they're up against the weather, they're up against the way they feed them, they're up against raccoons, they're up against, neighbours who don't really want them. So there are all sorts of dangers out there. It's a sort of, I suppose the title Brood gives you that idea of kind of the the grouping of a family. It gives you the idea of, yes, of sort of incubating, whether it be human or birdie, and also this kind of quiet introspection. She doesn't brood, but I suppose it's quite a good word for not having a full meltdown, because she kind of lets things go deliberately. I think she's grieving quite a lot. So it is a little bit about loss. It's very surprising. It's very beautiful. It's very poignant. And I think her observations of how, because that's what her mind focuses on, of how the birds look like, what they do, is for her sort of a way out of not delving too deep or not wallowing, if that's a fair thing to say, because grief takes us all differently, but that's her method. I found it a total captivation, and highly recommend it. And the last one in this series of the short and sweets is All the Horses of Iceland by Sarah Tolmie, and that one comes to us from Tor.com, which is I think that belongs to Macmillan, but it's it's the smallest of all of these, and it's an absolutely, it's distillation in written form. I don't know how she did this. It's a real condensation of so much in so few pages. I don't know. All of that opens out into an appetite for what she's talking about, and B, a kind of, you want it to go on. You're still journeying long after you've closed the final page on this book. It's kind of hard to categorize because, as she sort of says herself, it's not completely historically or factually accurate. So it kind of links itself into a sort of I suppose I have to say fantasy, in that elements of it are fantastical, but only because they are kind of culturally situated in the unspecified century or era in which we are set. So we have a man, Eyvind, and all of these things are sort of indistinct. There's a lot of blurring between what is true, what is historical and geographically, pinnable down, and what is just part of the story in that sort of fable-like telling that she does. So this young man, yes, he is. Eyvind, he's a single young man and has no offspring, and this seems to be a difficulty and is something that is dealt with in the story. He finds himself, traveling down from Iceland, which you understand is his home, and he's off to get, I think his intention is to trade. He's worked on ships, on boats, and with caravans going across mostly Northern Europe into Central Asia. But at some point it becomes clear to him that what he's going to do is he's going to try and bring horses, a particular type of horse, back to Iceland. And it is in one way the myth of how did the Icelandic horse get to be in Iceland when it's kind of inaccessible and there's no history of them having been born there. So we have a mythical white mare in this. It's a book that is really a kaleidoscope of culture and of faith. So it covers all of them, from the Jewish through to Christian, through to Muslim. There are what warring factions make of each other, and how if you believe this thing, you keep it quiet because you're with this clan leader. There are mentions of old magic, and at one point we end up in I think a sort of a settlement, if you like, where they are plagued, if you like, by a ghost who dies in childbirth and won't leave the fireside, because ghosts have to be invited into the fireside. And our main character, Eyvind, thinks, well, he doesn't think he's a magician, but he kind of thinks he knows how he'd sort this. So he offers his services. He says, I think I can sort this. And by doing this, he attracts the attention of a very old magician who sort of sees in him, someone who has some kind of healing or ways of dealing with things. And he kind of deals with the ghost problem. She's determined that it's he who will do this for her. And he notices this clan has this huge herd of horses, in amongst which there is this pure white one, which they unsee. They definitely don't see this horse. So it's about, is that horse real? Is that horse an incarnation of this lost woman? And if you name her as being that, that doesn't work for the... It's an astonishing sort of look at cultural practices, magical practices, and how he brings this herd, and the herd is captured, but this sort of supernatural horse, who is visible to some and not to others, acts as a kind of a guardian, if you like. Yet she's sort of dominating and yet dominated by him, because he has to ride her, but you sort of feel she's bestowing on him, well, I'll give in to you because it's in my interest, because I want to get to Iceland too and cut off from the world I've come to. It was a journey on which I suppose I felt sort of almost adrift on an ice flow, if you like, because it was very unchoppy. It was astonishing. It was seamless, this journey in and out of culture, and a kind of sort of detachment from any really hard emotional stuff. It was all kind of dancing out there in the light. That sounds a bit poetic. It's a very poetic book. And I was entranced. Jaw dropped. Absolutely astonishing. So a biggie for me, even though it's one of the smallest books I have. Keep reading.